Chapter 1. Byte 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Location. Birth year. 3100 Designation. Lost cause. That's how the situation of the world had come to be. A virus was all it took to stop the world from going in the direction it was supposed to. Humans were once the proud occupants of the planet, but now they had been turned into slaves. The catastrophe struck a century ago, yet to the humans, it felt like yesterday. It was a normal day, nothing unusual was happening. People were going about their daily work. When it happened, a virus of unknown origin was released simultaneously in 3 different parts of the world in countries formerly known as the USA, Russia, and Indonesia. No one was aware of what this virus was, but those who came into contact with the virus changed, and the virus changed a lot of people. Almost 70% to be precise. However, the change wasn't the same all over the world. The patients in America turned into a bunch of undead, but they weren't anything like the mindless ones which the pop culture was filled with. These undead did not crave brains and weren't weak at all. Far from it, they were agile, intelligent, and had super strength. It didn't take much time for them to spread like wildfire and force the rulers of the country to flee, and you know things have gotten bad when one of the superpowers had to abandon the nation. However, as a departing gift to the undead, the POTUS activated the nuclear football to nuke his own country. If they couldn't have their country, then no one could. But even that did not seem to affect the undead much, if at all. In fact, radiation from the nukes only further stimulated their evolution. Not to mention how many innocent people end up dying because of that. But Americans weren't the only ones dealing with such a problem. In Russia, thanks to the virus, the vampires had awakened to take control from the mortals because they were bored from being in slumber for so long. Something similar happened in Indonesia, and werewolves came into being. Soon the world that was run by humans had turned into a world full of monsters, leaving no other choice for mankind to leave the planet as soon as they could. But not everyone was able to board the spaceships, and as a result, more than 85% of the remaining human population was left on the planet for them to suffer. It had been a century since that event, and now the humans were slowly multiplying again. But this happened under strict surveillance and to serve a certain purpose. As livestock. The new rulers of the world had an appetite for only one thing: human flesh and blood. Although the undead didn't require to eat in order to live, the powerful families amongst the undead considered having human flesh for sustenance as a luxury and often organized hunts to obtain the meat. The cold ones weren't much different from them either. They too liked to hunt just as much as the undead from the west. But they had to do it for sustenance rather than fun. Unlike the undead, they needed to consume human blood regularly, or else they would get weaker and weaker from hunger. The lichens were an exception to this human-eating rule. Although some of them enjoyed human flesh, most of them only sustained themselves on the flesh from other mutated animals. This type of lichens who did not consume the flesh of the humans were known as vegetarians in their community. We should be thankful we were born in an area belonging to the lichens. An old man said in his frail voice, or else, our fate could have been far worse than it is now. A crowd of youngsters had gathered around the old man to listen to his tale while they waited for the others to cook food. After all, they did not have much to do there anyway. The lichens were kind enough to give them shelter, food, and utilities, so they were better off than the nearby zones that were governed by undeads and cold ones respectively. If this area belongs to the lichens, then why do we have other factions here? One of the kids excitedly asked. You have a sharp head, young one. The old man smiled wanly. About 50 years ago, the 3 great lords of each faction met to discuss a treaty to avoid fighting amongst themselves. According to that, each of the regions would have to establish 2 embassies for the other 2 factions to live in. That way, they would be able to live in peace while also being under each other's watchful eye. In a distance, Ashton Fenrir was watching the rest of them laughing and smiling. They had already heard this tale so many times and yet they keep listening to the same stories again and again as if they couldn't see the walls that surrounded them, or the guards who stood on top of the thick walls keeping an eye on them. With them being ready to kill anyone shall they misbehave in their presence. Standing 5 feet 6 inches tall, this brown-skinned man had a dismissive feel about him. A particularly notable feature on his face was his faint freckles and his elbow-length white hair. He also had a fresh, large bruise on his left foot which he is proud of. Of course, he would be proud of the bruise that he got from defying the orders of those beasts. In his long arms was an earthen bowl that had been empty for a while as a punishment for his actions. Ashton was used to being hungry because he would rather be punished than obey the command of the monsters who took his parents away 4 years ago. His short torso and bony hips were proof that he hadn't been feeding for quite some time. The others wanting to please the lichens always ostracized him. All of them wanted to be on the good side of their master or else, their master would have given them away as present to the cold ones or even worse, the undead. Keep sucking their paws you fools. Ashton spat out in anger before smashing the earthen bowl on the ground, breaking it into pieces. A couple of hours more and I'll leave this place to join the resistance. That's when you will realize it was me you all should have sided with. Chapter 2. Bite 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. The resistance. That was the only thing that kept Ashton going nowadays. Just the thought of somehow taking revenge for what the lichens did to his parents calmed his raging nerves. About a month ago, he had accidentally overheard the guards talking about the resistance and how they are becoming more and more troublesome now. Before then, he was completely oblivious about the existence of such an organization which was to be expected since they lived in the enclosure. They rarely if ever received any news from the outside world. Ever since that day, Ashton had made it a point to try and get more information about the resistance from the ever so careless guards. After snooping for a month, he was able to get a rough location of where their base was located. He wanted to snoop more and gather as much information as he could, but unfortunately, he was out of time. If only it wasn't for this mark. Ashton thought while scratching the tattoo of the werewolves on his right shoulder before looking out of the window as the moon shined with all its glory. He had already been marked by the ones who owned him. In the enclosure, it was nothing less than an honor to have the mark. The mark symbolized that the one had been chosen to live as a werewolf for the rest of his life, that is after spending 16 years as a human being. Ashton was marked the day his parents were taken away by the lichens to send as an offering to the undead and the cold ones respectively. Ashton still remembered the tears of his mother and the screams of his father as they were being taken away. He remembered how no one helped them. He remembered the feeling of despair he had back then. In that despair, he lashed out for the first time. The then 12-year-old Ashton picked up a baton that one of the soldiers had left behind while dragging his parents out, and rushed over to them. To this day, he still didn't know how he was able to do it, but he remembered jumping higher than he ever had, his fingers tightly wrapped around the baton. And then, his memory was hazy. He remembered hearing a voice but he wasn't so sure what he heard. The next thing he remembered, was that the guard had his skull split open while he had a bloody baton grasped around his hand. All of this happened right in front of the mistress. The alpha werewolf who was their owner. He still remembered her smile as she looked at him. Her ruby eyes were shining as if she had found some kind of treasure. It was the same day she'd marked him. Back then Ashton didn't know what was happening to him, but remembered a hot rod of iron searing his flesh. It had been almost 4 years since then, and it was his 16th birthday in 5 days. Meaning in 5 days he would be taken away from the enclosure to be turned into a wormut and serve the mistress, which was supposedly a great honor for his kind. Honor, my A.SS. I won't be anyone's slave. Ashton thought as he waited for everyone to sleep. Once they were asleep only then he could enact his plan to escape. Thankfully, he did not need to wait for long because it was a full moon that night. On the night of the full moon, the usual guards were replaced by the voluntary guards as the werewolves could not tolerate being out in full moon. It made them lose themselves to their primal nature, which wasn't good for anyone, thus they preferred to stay indoors. As for the voluntary guards, they were nothing but humans who abandoned their kind to serve the strong, even though they were treated like absolute shit by the Lycans. They were possibly the only ones whom Ashton detested even more than the Lycans. Time to move. Ashton slowly crawled off his bed and took a sack that he had already prepared. There wasn't much inside the sack, a couple of bottles of water and a few protein bars which he got using his status as a marked one from the guards a couple of weeks ago. He also had a rope with a small hook attached to it that was his weapon, as well as a utility tool to help him climb the walls. With all that equipment, he was ready to leave. But his luck ran out as soon as he stepped out of his quarters. Because he ran into the captain of the voluntary guards, Gustavo Valga. Standing 6 feet 0 inches tall, this dark-skinned man had an authoritative feel about him. He was covered in black gears from head to toe which helped him camouflage with the darkness around. One of the most notable features of his face was the large brown scar on his nose that covered the entire lower half of his square face. His ears were large and pointy, much like that of the Lycans. He had medium-length, wavy, brown hair which was left unstyled, while he wore his beard in a goatee. He also had a tattoo on his palm, signifying that he was a proud slave of the Lycans. Behind him were a dozen other men that consisted of his patrolling team. Ashton knew this man very well because he was once the closest friend of his father and also the one to betray him. Ashton felt nothing but disgust towards this man and the way he acted, all friendly with him despite knowing that Ashton hated him with all his being. Pretty late for a night stroll, Ashton. Gustavo smiled at him. Where are you going with all that baggage either way? For your sake, I hope you are not planning something as stupid as your father. Why? Are you planning to out me and get another promotion, backstabber? Ashton snapped at him. Whoa. Easy there, little fella. As for your question, I absolutely will, if I feel the need to. Gustav replied while brandishing the badge on his left shoulder. You have been honored with a mark, and for your sake, I hope you will honor it as well. Yeah, now leave me alone. I have to train. I only have 5 days to build myself up as much as I can before they take me away. Ashton spat on his feet before heading towards the gym that was used by the voluntary guards as well as him. It was one of the other perks of being marked. Ashton got to use their resources whenever he wanted. Not like he used them often. Another fool, just like his father. Gustavo shook his head and moved on with his patrolling team. Chapter 3. Byte 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. This is not good. Not good at all. Ashton gritted his teeth trying to fight through the pain he was in. Ashton wanted to scream but he couldn't afford to. After using the gym building as a cover, he was successfully able to get out of the enclosure after climbing the walls. However, the happiness he felt was short-lived as he got stuck afterwards. He had a great plan in his mind, but there was one thing he hadn't accounted for completely. Traps. The enclosure was surrounded by more than 100 traps to keep the monsters away from the precious human food. Yup, there were monsters in the world apart from werewolves, vampires and zombies. As just like they evolved from humans who came in contact with the virus, some animals were exposed to the virus as well. These animals mutated into numerous kinds of monsters. Some were so dangerous even the werewolves were a bit hesitant to mess with. And the favorite meal of these monsters? Human flesh, of course. It had been more than a century since humans were on the top of the food chain, and now they rejoiced their place at the bottom with not even the plants being below them. Even the food they ate in the enclosure was specially made for them right from the scratch. Ashton thought he knew about all of the locations where the traps had been hidden. Apparently, he was wrong and was stuck in one of those traps. Luckily he was far away from the enclosure for anyone to see him, but that also worked against him. Since he couldn't be seen, it was unlikely the guards would be able to see the night creatures either. Which meant, if he was to get attacked, there wasn't anything anyone could have done to save him. Even his makeshift weapon would not be enough to help him out of the mess he was in right now. Not to mention, he was bleeding hard. The sharp teeth of the bear trap had dug themselves deep within his foot. But the pain he was suffering wasn't the only cause of his worry. Ashton was worried more because of the blood he was leaking. As far as he had heard, the night creatures had a highly sensitive sense of smell, and human blood was something they all craved for. Thus, he was like a sitting target for the night creatures. At this point, he was even contemplating cutting his leg off. However, he did not have any weapons to do that. Heck, even if he did have the tools, what good would cutting his leg off do to him? He would get free from the trap, but what next? In fact, sacrificing his limbs would do him more harm than good, as chopping his leg down would make him bleed even more. Hence, attracting more night creatures and fending them off with one leg did not seem to be a good idea either. In a way, he was better off with the trap chomping on his leg. At least while sitting he would be able to defend himself better rather than while hopping on one leg. While all these scenarios were playing inside his head, he heard a noise coming from behind. He tried to look back, but his leg did not allow him to turn back enough to see what was going on. However, the moon was shining above him, and with the help of the moonlight, Ashton was able to see the shadow of the figure approaching him. Judging by the shadow, it was most likely to be one of the guards. A feeling of relief splashed over his face. As much as he wanted to escape from that place, dying was much worse than living as a captive. The guards would save him and take him back. It went without saying that he would be punished for trying to escape. However, since he had been personally marked by the mistress, he would probably not receive any harsh punishment. "Can you please get this trap off my feet?" "Oh no. Stay away." Ashton's eyes widened in horror as the figure got closer to him. The smell of rotting flesh entered his nostrils. There was no mistaking it, his blood had attracted an undead to him. But what was the undead doing here? It was Leakin territory. Undead and vampires were not allowed to step foot there. However, there was no denying that there was an undead standing behind him. Ashton struggled to get the hooked rope out of his bag, at least have something to defend himself with. But before he could do anything, the undead grabbed his head and slammed it hard on the ground. Blood spewed out of Ashton's mouth as soon as his head was slammed against the rocky terrain. Following the attack, a constant ringing sound flooded his ears while his vision got blurry. Even in his state of confusion, Ashton could feel a gust of wind brush across his exposed head as blood drizzled out of his head as well. Ashton saw the creature effortlessly rip the bear trap off of his feet with its bare hand before lifting him. Through his blurry vision, he got the first look at his assailant. The undead appeared to be a teenager just like him and had green eyes. The hairs on his head were falling off from places, just like the clothes on his pale greenish skin. He was shorter and thinner than Ashton, yet he had strength that Ashton didn't. Before Ashton could see anything else, the undead bit him hard on the shoulder and tore off a large piece of flesh from there. Ashton wanted to scream in pain, but his body didn't even have enough energy left to scream. His mind slowly turned foggy as his vision got darker and darker. So this the end? Ashton thought as the memories from this life started flashing before him. The undead was about to sink his teeth into his flesh again, but before that could happen, something pulled him out of the undead's grasp and he was thrown away like a discarded toy. He wanted to see who saved him but couldn't as his vision completely turned black and he lost consciousness. Chapter 4. I'm a what? 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ashton woke up with a start. He could hear the howling sound of the winds as thick raindrops knocked on the window. He was a sweating mess, all of his clothes were drenched as if he had been outside in the rain and not sleeping in his bed. He looked around only to realize he was back in his bed. How am I in my room? Ashton mumbled, was it a nightmare? As soon as he recalled what happened, and his heart started pumping crazily. He could feel the blood rushing through his veins. Strangely, he wasn't in pain anymore. This made him think that maybe he really had a nightmare. But then again, He vividly remembered how he escaped from the enclosure only to run into an undead who bit him. The pain he felt back then, there was no way in hell it was just a nightmare. There was only one way to prove whether it was a nightmare or not. Ashton threw the blanket off of himself to check himself for wounds. But there were none. Not a single scratch was on his body. His legs were fine, there were no signs of any harm done by the trap to him. He then touched his shoulder where the undead had bitten him, and sure enough, there was nothing there either. Was it really a nightmare? Ashton mumbled and jumped out of his bed and looked underneath it. The supplies he had been saving for weeks were gone. There is no way in hell I hallucinated about gathering those things. The absence of the sack full of items seemed to make him believe that what happened was indeed true and not a nightmare. He could feel something was off, but he couldn't point out what. Everything contradicted itself. His missing supplies pointed at him leaving the enclosure as he had planned and remembered, but the lack of wounds on his body said otherwise. Ashton couldn't think of anything that could possibly explain what had happened there. All of a sudden, he remembered someone saved him from the clutches of the undead. Maybe it was that person who brought him back there. But even if that was true, it wouldn't explain the disappearance of his wounds. He went back to his bed. His head had begun hurting because of all the thinking he had been doing. But in his panicked state, he hadn't noticed something blinking in front of his eyes. No, it wasn't like he hadn't noticed it, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him because he got up too quickly. But now that he was back in bed and the thing kept blinking in front of his eyes, he could no longer ignore it. What is it? Ashton tried to touch whatever the yellow blinking thing was, but his hand phased right through it, so annoying. Just get out of my sight already. Calibration in progress. All of a sudden, his head started pounding like crazy. He was fine just now but not anymore. He tightly wrapped his arms around the head trying to stop the pain. The pain soon spread from his head to his entire body. It left as if his body was being torn apart and put back together simultaneously. The endless cycle of pain continued. He could feel his bones break and then be joined together again. This kept going on until the yellow shining thing turned red and then turned black. As soon as it turned black, the pain he was going through stopped. He wasn't sweating anymore. Nor were his bones out of place. Even his heart wasn't pounding anymore. While taking irregular breaths, Ashton placed the palm of his hand on his chest, to calm himself. But as soon as he did that he realized something. It wasn't that his heart had stopped pounding. It had stopped beating altogether. He immediately jumped to check his pulse and he felt nothing there either. He started panicking again, and as he did, some black letters appeared in front of him. He had never seen those symbols before in his life, but somehow he knew exactly what those symbols meant. Transformation successful. You have been turned into. Chapter 5. I'm a what? 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ashton woke up alone with the sun. He instinctively looked outside the window. The sky was still black, but the clouds were slowly moving farther and farther away. The heavenly downpour had stopped 15 minutes ago, but Ashton could still see people walking around with umbrellas over their heads. Something seemed to be going around in the courtyard. Ashton tried to get a good look outside, but as soon as he saw whatever little bit of sunlight there was, his head was started pounding furiously. However, the pain wasn't as unbearable as before and soon it disappeared altogether. The sudden headache seemed to have reminded him of last night. However, when he tried recalling what happened last night, he felt a sharp pain in his head. This time the pain was too much for him to handle. It felt as if someone or something was trying to forcefully rip his head into two. As soon as he stopped focusing on recalling what had happened last night, the pain stopped. It was as if his mind was trying to block him from remembering last night. However, despite whatever was stopping him, Ashton remembered one thing. Something like he had only a week or so to live as a human being and then we would turn into something else. He got up and took a look underneath his bed and sure enough, the sack was there with all the items he had collected. Meaning he hadn't left the enclosure. But he still felt like he had. Maybe it was a nightmare after all, he thought, and sat back down on the bed. He was still in the middle of sorting himself out when he heard someone pounding on his cell door. Yes, he lived in a cell alone while the others had to share a large barn to sleep in. Not only that, they had to share a lot of common commodities like washroom, showers, utensils, etc. But he didn't. His room had everything a man needed to live. Washroom and shower with a constant supply of clean water. He even had a heater installed there. Again, it was all thanks to him being marked by the mistress. None of these things was there when he was marked initially, but was constructed later on because the mistress didn't want her pretty little mutt to live in any kind of discomfort. Especially after taking his parents away. That being said, his hatred for the lichens ran deeper than his need to be comfortable. He had spent 12 years in the barn living like animals, and he wasn't going to change that for the last 4 years of his life. Ashton's thoughts were once again interrupted by the loud banging on his door. Judging by the way the bastards were knocking on his door, he knew the lichens were there to force him to eat or to give him some punishment. He went ahead and opened up the door. He was completely prepared to take a punch for making them wait as usual. Ednell.co. However, something entirely unexpected happened there. Although he was right that the lichens were knocking on his door, once he opened up he didn't receive a punch as he had expected. Instead, he felt someone patting his head. Ashton opened his eyes and immediately jumped back from the shock when he saw who was standing in front of him. It was the mistress and her bodyguards. Seeing them there was such a shock because even though the mistress owned them, she rarely ever visited the enclosure. What are they doing here? There still should be 4 days till I turn 16. Ashton's thoughts were written all over his face, which the mistress read in an instant. Her ruby eyes gleamed with excitement when she saw Ashton's grown-up body. Her blonde hairs fluttered behind her while the group of bodyguards rushed into his room and started packing his things up. Ashton tried to turn around and see what was going on, but for some reason, his eyes were focused on the mistress. She had not stopped smiling ever since she saw Ashton. He looked up at her triangular face and realized she looked younger than he remembered. Her brown skin was no longer dull like he remembered, but instead, it was glowing even under the cloudy sky. Next, Ashton's attention fell on her small nose and puffy lips. He tried to stop there, but it was like his eyes weren't in his control anymore, and the next second he found himself checking her out. Her arms were much more muscular than his, coupled with her thick torso, well-stacked breast that her black corset was trying its best to hold back, along with her well-defined waist and long legs. You are quite lively for someone who has been sleeping for about 4 days. The mistress' voice seemed to have snapped him out of his trance. Not to mention your body looks muscular, unlike what I was told. I wasn't aware that puberty could do such things to humans. Interesting. Ashton had not noticed it yet, but now that the mistress had pointed it out, his physique had definitely changed for the better. He saw his reflection in the broken mirror and was shocked to see how he looked. He had grown a couple of inches and he was no longer skinny but more or less looked like one of the Leakin guards. His body had turned itself into something entirely different from who he was. He was really confused as to what was happening, and then it struck him. I was asleep for 4 days, he softly mumbled. However, before anyone could reply, the bodyguards wrapped a piece of cloth around his head and dragged him outside. It was time for Ashton to join them. Chapter 6. Ceremony 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ashton still had the cover wrapped around his head. However, if it was true that 4 days had been passed, then he knew where he was being taken to. It was time for his induction ceremony. As he was being dragged through the courtyard, he could hear the cheers from the other humans. They were celebrating as if he had won a battle or something. Pathetic as shoals. Ashton crushed the humans under his breath. This wasn't something anyone should be celebrating. He was being taken hostage for God's sake. He had wanted to join the resistance, not the lichens. He still didn't know what happened to his plan or whether he was fed some kind of sleeping tablet to make sure he wouldn't leave the place even if he wanted to. But it was for that same reason he had not been eating anything that he was offered for the last few days. Then how come did he get all tangled up in the mess? He tried using his newly transformed physique to free himself, but against full-fledged werewolves, his strength was just like that of a toddler. No matter how much he struggled, there was nothing he could do now. It was too late. His fate was already sealed. Just like that, he was thrown in a car where two lichens hold him down as they rode on. He could still faintly hear the cheers of the others. However, soon everything turned into silence and the only things he could hear were the sound of the car heading towards an unknown location. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Ashton kept cursing under his breath. He was angry with himself. After everything he had done in the last couple of months, all his plans went straight to drain. He just wanted one thing. To avenge his parents, and now he wouldn't be able to do crap about it. Once he was converted into a werewolf, there was nothing he would be able to do against the lichens. Loyalty was programmed in their blood as the human gene was replaced by those of the lichens. No matter what kind of disagreement they had, the lichens would have to stay true to their pack. However, for those who still tried to defy the pack and go against them existed the death penalty or worse. Exile. Some would have thought being exiled was better than dying, when in reality being exiled was far worse than a quick death. The world was not a good place to roam around without proper preparation. The undead, the cold ones and the lichens were bad, but there were far worse things out there that no one even knew about because whoever set out to discover about hidden monsters, never returned back. Earth wasn't Earth anymore but chaos. The only semblance of order there was on the planet was the various kingdoms/regions that had been made by the new lords of the world. Right now, Ashton and the lichens were headed towards one such place. The capital city of the kingdom of Lycania, known as Deja. Deja was also the city where the mistress had indomitable influence. One could say she was the uncrowned queen of that city. It was a title that wasn't far from reality. She was, after all, one of the many illicit children of the king. She was considered to be the most gifted individual among all of the king's children, but since she was born out of wedlock, the purists within the Lycan society did not allow the king to treat her as his daughter. It was the same reason she was dead set on making the royal family's life as miserable as possible. All of a sudden, the car stopped. They had arrived at their location, the mistress mansion. It might have seemed like a mere couple of minutes since their journey started, however, it was all thanks to their technological advancements that they were able to make a cross-country trip within minutes. The man sitting on his right side grabbed Ashton by his nape and pulled him out of the car. His head was still covered so he couldn't see a thing, but he could feel the eyes on him. Hundreds of them were looking at him. Some with hunger in their eyes, while some were looking at him with peculiar interest. You have obtained a new skill. Low-grade perception. Perception. A prime ability found in bloodsuckers. It is the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through the senses. You can now sense the intention of low-leveled beings through this skill. Grade. Low condition to upgrade the skill. Achieve maximum friendliness/hostility with any intelligent being or use 5 skill points to level this skill up. Current vampiric skill points. 0. Chapter 7. Ceremony 2. You are listening at Novel Full.audio. What Searman? Ashton finally found his voice back, but as soon as he opened his mouth, one of the werewolves forced a piece of cloth in his mouth, before forcing him to look towards the mistress. Humans are not allowed to talk in this hall, sweetie. She said in her awfully seductive voice, also, that cloth will help you tolerate the pain caused during the conversion. The following moment she stood up and threw away her coat. Surprisingly, she wasn't wearing anything underneath it and was now stark naked in front of Ashton and everyone else. However, everyone else quickly averted their eyes away from her. But our boy didn't. It was Ashton's first time seeing a woman naked and his eyes fixated upon the beauty of the mistress' body. But the sight only lasted for the fraction of a second before she began turning to her true self. Soon her body was covered in thick fur as the bones within her body began contorting. She grew at least by 2 feet in height while her torso became abnormally huge and so did her legs. Ashton could see the bones within her body moving and shifting places. Several of them even ruptured through her skin and yet there wasn't a tinge of pain on her face. Her fingers grew abnormally large and so did her fingernails. Her crimson eyes turned yellowish as her pupils dilated and became one with the rest of the eye. Her ears were already pointed, but they even grew even more. However, the most horrifying thing Ashton saw was the emergence of her charcoal-colored snout. Her beautiful face was ripped in half as her jaws began elongating. Her jaws really looked terrifying, but even worse was her abnormally large teeth. Just one of them was bigger than Ashton's entire skull. With that, Ashton had witnessed one of the rarest moments any human ever had. He had seen a werewolf transforming. It felt as if hours had passed since the mistress began transforming into her true self, but the transformation only took a couple of seconds. Although the transformation was nothing but gruesome, the end result was really beautiful. For some reason, the mistress' white fur and muscular body looked appealing to Ashton. Beautiful, aren't I? Even though she had transformed into a werewolf, her voice was still the same. She slowly approached him who was still helplessly kneeling in front of him. Everyone's gazes were still averted from the mistress as if looking at her was a crime. What Ashton didn't know was that the mistress was leaking a visual pheromone that causes a chemical reaction with the body of the living upon seeing her. It could be said that, just by looking at her, the others could become slaves to her will. That was the reason no one was looking at her, while she was exposing herself to his eyes. It was a rare skill, only the alpha female werewolves possessed and was generally used to attract the males towards them. In this case, the male was Ashton and she was seducing him in a way. But there was a downside to this skill. It worked on humans only after they crossed a certain age, that age being 16. This was the reason why 16-year-olds were chosen to be converted into werewolves. It was also the age when the hormones usually go crazy in their bodies, making it easier for the female werewolves to proceed with the ceremony. The werewolves holding Ashton down suddenly let go of him and backed up. Being too close to the mistress when she was leaking pheromones, could also activate their primal instincts. Thus it was safer to keep distance from her. Although Ashton was now free to run if he wanted to, he didn't. Or in other words, he was too mesmerized to move on his own. All of a sudden, the mistress wrapped her claws around his face while gently caressing it. This will hurt a lot. The next moment, she opened her gigantic jaws and bit him in the neck. The pain snapped Ashton out of the trance, however, it was too late to do anything now. He could thrash his limbs all he wanted but the mistress had her claws tightly wrapped around him. He screamed and screamed but no one came to save him as his blood spurted out everywhere as his vision slowly started to fade. He once again felt a familiar presence around him. He saw a blinking light in front of him as everything turned black. Seeing the light brought back the memories that he had been trying to remember ever since waking up from his slumber. He once again saw similar texts that he had before. Transformation successful, you have been turned into. Chapter 8. Training 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. His blood tasted a bit weird. Mistress mumbled as she slowly reverted back to her human self, it's probably because he had the blessing, but still, it's an observation worth noticing. One of her servants immediately rushed over to her and handed her coat. The mistress wiped Ashton's excessive blood off her face before wearing the coat. When she was done covering herself, everyone else finally turned towards her. He's bleeding a bit too much. Get a healer to seal the wound and lock him up in his room. I should take a week for his powers to manifest and then, we'll begin his training. The mistress ordered one of her servants before squatting next to an unconscious Ashton and caressing his bloodied face. "I have high hopes from you, my precious pawn. You will become my new sword to tear the king's family in half." She looked at Ashton with a passion in her eyes that made the others jealous of him. Even though they know how important he was to the mistress. Witnessing the look on the mistress's face as the boy was being taken away was a bit gut-wrenching for the others, but at the same time, it meant and harming the boy in any way would make the mistress lose her cool. Their mistress had turned a lot of novices over the years. Countless pawns had been formed and destroyed over the decades, but none of them had been able to make the mistress be so protective of them. Maybe the kid was truly exceptional. Maybe the kid truly had received the blessing, and if it was the truth, then it would mean that the kid was the first and only human to receive something that only the three major races monsters could get. By the three major monster races it meant werewolves, vampires, and zombies. "Mistress, are you sure? Do you still doubt me, Donovan?" Mistress glared at the man who raised his hand to ask her a question. Being respectful and knowing one's rightful place were the only rules in her court. Thus even if someone had a suggestion or question for her, they had to seek permission before speaking. Donovan was the only exception to this rule, as he was the mistress's first mate as well as the first one she had ever converted into a lecan. Standing 6 feet 1 inch tall, this caramel-skinned man had a powerful feel about him. Unlike everyone else in the court, he did not fear the mistress and was her trusted sword. He had shoulder-length brown hair which had been carefully styled in a ponytail to match his beaded beard. He had a muscular body that complemented his large torso. He had 2 swords strapped on his fairly toned waist. I do. How can a human possibly have the genes needed to activate the blessing? It's completely unheard of. Donovan spoke his mind on the matter. It's the reason that it's unheard of that would make it possible for me to give my father a scar to remember me by." The mistress waved Donovan's concerns aside. "You were there that day, weren't you? The day that frail-looking 12-year-old killed one of your elite guards with just a baton, that too with a single strike. You saw the crimson glow in his eyes, didn't you?" I did. You know what that means, don't you?" "Yes, mistress." "Then stop wasting time and set up an appropriate training facility for the boy. You and I, both will give him the necessary training that he needs in order to attend the academy. Anyone else has any questions?" The mistress said in a definitive tone. "Then, I'll be off to rest. Donovan, join me after you are done with the preparations." "As you wish, mistress." Everyone bowed before her as she left the throne room. Only when she left the throne room did the others decide to speak their mind. Although they were doing what the mistress asked of them, they still didn't completely agree with her decision. Turning others into werewolves was not an issue. It wasn't uncommon for the lycans to make use of the humans to strengthen their ranks. That was if they didn't eat them first. But how could their mistress turn someone as unpredictable as the boy without doing proper research was beyond their reasoning. "Sir Donovan, we must eliminate the boy before it's too late." One of the 12 ministers spoke her mind, but she was still hiding behind her mask. "The boy would definitely become a sword worthy of the mistress's name, but his unpredictable nature might spell trouble for us later. Especially because he loathes us for taking away his traitorous parents." Numerous others nodded their heads in agreement. However, the moment she was finished speaking, Donovan drew one of his swords and grazed her neck. Everyone was shocked by his hostile reaction and stepped back in fear. "I will not persuade her to do otherwise. If she wants to train the kid herself, she must have seen something our eyes couldn't," Donovan declared before sheathing his sword. "However, if the boy fails her, I'll be the first one to dig my canines in his flesh. You can rest assured about that." Chapter 9. Training 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As Ashton slowly opened his eyes, he was greeted by a light blinking in front of him, followed by some random mumbo-jumbo. He had been asleep for all this time and thus it took a while for his eyes to focus themselves enough for him to make sense of what was written in front of him. Gene integration successful. You have been transformed into the first of its kind. Instead of thinking about what was in front of him, Ashton was more interested in knowing where he was at the moment. It appeared to be a lavish bedroom and was twice as big as the barn the humans were forced to live in. Ashton slowly got up and stretched his muscles. However, as he was doing that, he realized his physique had changed yet again. He wasn't as buffed as he had been before, but for some reason, he felt way stronger than he had before. At the same time, his body felt lighter and he could see even the tiniest details around him. Be it a speck of dust or the tiniest droplet on the window. There's a mirror there. He got off his bed and slowly made his way towards the ornamented mirror to see how he really looked like. Is that really me? He couldn't believe what he was seeing. His face was still the same but everything else about him had been changed. His hair had turned white just like his skin, while his eyes had changed and now had a crimson glow in them. But most importantly, he was now sporting ears that looked similar to that of the lichens but at the same time. He also had abnormally huge canines just like that of the cold ones. That was enough to surprise him, but there was something else. His skin, it was dull just like that of the undead. What the hell is wrong with me? Gene integration successful. You have been transformed into the first of its kind. Once again the same text flashed in front of his eyes, but this time he didn't ignore it. He read through it and as he did he was shocked to no extent. He had become a hybrid between a zombie, a vampire and a werewolf. That's why he was sporting all of those traits that were unique to a certain type of monster only. All of a sudden, a black light flashed in front of him and it felt like a sealed chest of memories opened inside his head. For 4 days, Ashton enjoyed his slumber. He couldn't remember the things he had been dreaming about but thanks to being knocked out for 4 days, his fuzzy memory was clearer now. He finally remembered what had happened to him. He remembered he was bitten by all the 3 major monster races. First by a zombie, then a vampire and lastly a werewolf and now he had been turned into a monster the world had never seen before. Why? 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 Ashton roared in rage before slamming his fist into the mirror, shattering it into thousands of pieces. Is this for real? The black light glowed once again but this time Ashton was asked a question that confused him even more than he already was. Would you like to view a tutorial to acquaint you with the system? System? What system? Please tell me this is a dream. Trait confirmed. The user is a moron. Proceeding with the explanation either way. What? With every passing moment, Ashton ended up being confused even more than he had been a second ago. All of a sudden, everything went dark around him. The only thing in front of him was an awkward dot-looking screen. Name. Ashton Fenrir species. Zombie, active, vampire, active, werewolf, active, human, deceased. Status. Undead class. Unassigned age. 16 years gender. Male grade. F. Tier, evolution is possible, affiliation. Unaffiliated. Level. Vampire level. 0 werewolf level. 0 zombie level. 0 stats. HP, 1000/1000 damage. 14 armor. 12 stealth. 5 stamina. 15 agility. 14 intelligence. 2 nature. Bratty abilities/skills/spells. Vampire skills. Low grade perception transformation, vampire, werewolf skills. Transformation, werewolf, zombie skills. Transformation, zombie, current vampiric skill points. 0 current werewolf skill points. 0 current undead skill points. 0, an administrator had been assigned to carry on with the explanation. This is your status plate. Here you can view all of your stats as well as the list of the abilities that you have learned. You can learn new skills as you discover more about the world or through a variety of other experiences. You can upgrade these skills by fulfilling certain conditions or by spending specific points. You know what, at this point, I don't even care what's happening with me. It's too much for me to handle all this stress. Spoken like a true moron. Either way, I am bound to explain everything to you as I'm paid to do this. And a couple of private reasons. As I was saying, you can earn species points by performing certain tasks as listed below. Vampiric skill points. 1 point can be earned by consuming 5 milliliters of blood. With the increasing rarity of the blood, you can earn more points. You can drink monster blood as well. Undead skill points. 1 point can be earned by consuming 50 grams of flesh. With the increasing rarity of the flesh, you can earn more points. You can eat monster flesh as well. Werewolf skill points. You can earn points by killing and defeating other monsters. One of the toughest types of points to earn. With the increasing rarity of the monster defeated, you can earn more points. Ashton sighed heavily because he couldn't understand a thing he was being told. Well, he could understand it, but he was unable to make any sense out of it. According to the information displayed in front of him, he was dead as a human. Which was enough of a shock to kill him once again, but for some reason, he didn't feel a thing. As if he was expecting himself to be dead all along. He was standing there as if nothing was wrong with his body. Even though he was dead as a human, he was still alive as a blend of different monsters. I don't know why you're sulking, the weird text appeared in front of him again. You know you have the potential to become one of the strongest beings on the planet, right? Wait, what? You really are a moron, huh? You are the only being who has been successful in bonding with 3 different types of monster genes. No one has any idea how strong you can be. So you're telling me I can take revenge for my dead parents. Take revenge, rule the planet, make an intergalactic harem. You can do whatever you want to. That is if you can attain the strength to do so. You want to gain strength, right? I do. Then do as you are told and you're set. But who the hell are you? And why are you helping me? The name's Lucifer, your administrator/helper. As far as helping you is concerned, it is my job and just like you, I also want to get revenge of my own. I see. Ashton thought losing humanity would be a huge blow to him, but if he could avenge his parents then he had no problem becoming a pawn for anyone else. Chapter 10. Training 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. There were a lot of things Ashton wanted to talk about and confirm. Like who was Lucifer? What was the system? What was happening to his body and what did he mean by him being an admin? All this along with a crap ton of other things. However, a knock on the door interrupted the chat between Ashton and Lucifer. Someone's here. Ashton looked around him and saw the mess he had created. But most importantly he saw what he looked like through those broken shards. He knew he couldn't let anyone see him like he was right now or else his secret would be out and he might as well be thrown out or even get experimented on or some sh.it. What do I do? What do I do? Just deactivate the traits you don't want. What do you mean? See the black light in front of you. Imagine it is a switch and try to click it. Ashton did as he was told and once again the familiar tab containing his information popped up. Can you see, active, written against all of your species? Just click on them and they will deactivate. Be careful. Before Lucifer could explain what would happen to him, Ashton quickly deactivated the zombie and vampire traits simultaneously. As he did that, he fell on his knees from the gut-wrenching pain. Because it would hurt like hell. Slowly Ashton's skin turned back to its normal shade and his canines disappeared and were replaced by normal teeth that he had before. Even his hair turned back to as it had been for all his life. But as it all was happening, Ashton felt like his insides were being churned and pulled at the same time. The only thing that remained was his pointy ears and crimson eyes that signified he had become one of the lichens. Or more specifically, he had become one of the mistress dogs. "Look kid, I know you are hurting and all, but I don't have much time here. So I'll continue to tell you what I can before they cut me off. Or better yet, I'll leave a memo. See you later." And just like that, Lucifer's voice disappeared before Ashton could ask him any questions. However, as that happened, a wall of text appeared in front of him. Points to remember. Never ever deactivate all 3 of your active traits. If you do so, your 4th species trait will activate, which is deceased human. Meaning, you'll die, but this time it'll be for real. Also be careful while activating and deactivating traits because of the pain due to transformation. If you activate or deactivate more than one trait simultaneously, the pain you will feel would become 10 times worse than what it would be while switching one of the traits. Mind that the levels of a certain species never exceed more than 5 levels than the others. That is, try to maintain equal levels for zombie, vampire, and werewolf genes. For example, if you're a level 10 werewolf, then the other traits must be level 5 at the very least. In case you are unable to maintain that level gap, then it would destroy the harmony between the genes and they'll start overpowering one another. Once again it would be painful and you might even die as a result. Or worse, your powers will get exposed to higher UPS here and they'll kill me along with you. You can gain levels by transforming and fighting. For example, if you fight while in being werewolf form, you'll level up as a werewolf. It's the same for every other species as well. The others can see your status plate when you use it, but I've tinkered around with it so that they'll only be able to the stats you want them to see. Also, if anyone asks the color of your blessing, always say it's yellow. Not red, blue or black. Always yellow. Lastly, you won't be able to talk with me or anyone else from the association from now on. Thus you are on your own. I'll pop up every now and then to check up on you. But for now, this is it. __Noel.N. Ashton was still feeling dizzy from the pain when the door was thrown open and a dozen or so werewolves came rushing in. So it's true. This fucker was awake but did not think he needed to open the door. Donovan mumbled after sparing Ashton one look, "Mistress has an eye for talented individuals." A transformation that should have taken a week was completed in 4 days. Impressive. Very impressive. Let's begin your training then, shall we? Ashton tried getting back up to his feet, but before he could, Donovan kicked him right across the face. Ashton's head was still a mess and hence, he couldn't balance himself. As a result, he fell on the pile of glass shards as they got buried under his skin as the floor was marked with his blood. Arg! Ashton let out a painful groan as the glass shards got buried in his back. Impressive but weak. You'll have to train a lot if you want to get into the academy, Donovan said before pushing Ashton even further into the pile of glass shard with the help of his feet. "Oh sorry, I thought there was a piece of shit on the floor, so I had to check whether what I saw was correct or not. But looks like it was just you." Arg! Ashton yelled again, but the louder he got, the more pressure Donovan applied on him and the deeper the shards got buried within his body. Ashton was in pain, but the pain he was feeling suddenly decreased by a bit. He was still hurting pretty bad and he almost wanted to cry, but it wasn't as bad as it had been before. Suddenly, he received another notification. You have obtained a new skill. Pain Tolerance, LVL1. Pain Tolerance, LVL1. A common ability found in werewolves. This skill lessens the pain one experiences by 2%. Each level improves the tolerance by 2%. This passive skill can be leveled up automatically by feeling more pain. Grade. Low condition to upgrade the skill. Get acquainted with pain. Yeah. I'll do that. Arg.